I like to think of myself as like a professional nut handler. I cover them in like herbs, spices, sugar, caramel. I make them into a praline. I mean, there's a tons of ways to treat your little nuggets right, and I'll show you how. And I think it's fair to say,
I like nuts. A lot.
some of my nuts are raw, so let's roast them. I'll be honest, I just throw my nuts in at 350 Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius until they're just brown and smelling good, but I'll link to a resource in the description for the nerds. As a quick side mission, let's blanch some almonds. It's stupid easy, just let them sit in boiling water for 30 seconds. Only way to mess this up is just not to set a timer, which is exactly what I did. Still not a bad guess though. Just rinse them under some cold water, they should be ready to pop out their skins with just a little squeeze. It's definitely a labor of love, but the really super bitter almond skin just doesn't jive with some recipes.
Mission failed. We'll get them next time.
This is something great to do in the downtime between some of these like aperitivo nut recipes, and honestly, it's satisfying in a weird way. But they're still raw, so when we finish, we're gonna have to roast them, of course. Okay, the awkward ones. Roasted, pre-salted. Sometimes it's the only option around, but it's not a big deal at all. Just rinse your nuts in 3 or 4 quick cold water baths, but don't let them dilly-dally or use any warm water. We want them absorbing as little water as possible. Trust me, these nuts won't shrink in cold water. Give it a taste, and if it tastes wet and bland, then you're on the right track. Try your best to really get all the water off these now. I mean, a few seconds here can really literally be like a few minutes in the oven. I dry these out in a pretty cool oven, generally about 280 Fahrenheit or 140 Celsius. We'll get the job done fairly fast without risking accidentally over-roasting your nuts. Pistachios and macadamias are just a little more fragile though, so just be careful not to overdo it. Like, you guessed it, like I did. You'll see later. It's tough to get a good read on whether or not it's ready directly out the oven, so I leave a nut or two just hanging around on the counter for a minute to cool off before checking the texture. This tray's looking good, so I'll just whack it out on the counter. There's a ton of oil left in this tray, which can happen if your nuts are oil roasted, like these were, instead of just dry roasted like what we're doing. Same deal with the macadamias and pistachios. We've got to let these cool fully before we can move on, which frankly is totally fine. It gives me plenty of time to mess around and injure myself with a literal drywall knife.
Oh wow, man.
On a more productive note, let's start prepping our seasonings. The slow is first, of course, and that's going to be a big tray of Parmesan crisp. It's as simple as just grating a ton of Parmesan onto a silpat, grinding on some black pepper, and whacking it into a 400 Fahrenheit or 200 Celsius oven for like 8 to 10 minutes. Give it a bit of a cool, and then just break it up like you're some cheesy off-brand Jesse Pinkman. I mean, the larger the chunks, the worse it sticks later on, so ideally you'd be sending this in a spice grinder to really powder it up, but I don't have one. So once you're done scar-facing some Parmesan powder, we've got to organize a bit. Get these dried nuts away once they're fully cooled, and let's move on to the next step. Egg. As a pastry chef, I've cracked untold eggs through my career, and I've genuinely been asked multiple times the best way to do it. As you can see, the typical way can be a bit challenging. You may not like it, but this is actually the optimal way to crack eggs, as determined by Harsanyi's dialectical analysis of the late great Ken Arrow's impossibility theorem.
Wow.
Bottled pasteurized egg whites work perfectly fine as well, as does aquafaba, that liquid in chickpea cans, if you want to make these vegan or you have egg allergies. And you can also use other viscous liquids like honey, maple syrup, but of course these are going to affect the flavor. Let's get everything organized now. All the nuts should be dry, roasted, cooled, pushed off to the side. And frankly, I wasn't going to mention this, but I remembered how an old intern had to be taught this. Weigh your liquids separately from your spices. The actual process is super simple. Just get your nuts in a bowl, pour in your liquids, and toss to combine. This can take a little bit, so just keep at it until there's no longer a little pool of liquid at the bottom. It's pretty tough to overmix here, and leaving behind liquid will totally scuff your drying process later, so be careful. I'm mixing my peanuts with a spicy Harissa and Chipotle blend, making the absolute perfect beer nut. I avoided pre-blending these spices just so it's easier to show off, but you should absolutely pre-mix your additions before pouring it over your nuts to help along the process. This is because overmixing your nuts with chunky seasonings like sesame or poppy will actually cause more of it to fall off the nut. However, something with just powders is really user-friendly and allows me to kind of just cheese some steps. Next up are rosemary, garlic, macadamia nuts using bottled egg whites. Same deal, I give it a little toss to combine, just make sure you don't have a little pool at the bottom. Earlier, I chopped up some dried rosemary just to make it a little easier to integrate, but it's still a little chunky. Another good technique to help mix these more gently is adding your spices in multiple layers with really just a gentle toss or two in between. Once these are looking nice and even, you're good to go, but let's just set them aside for now and move on to our ginger garlic sesame almonds. In the liquids for this, I added a bit of sesame oil and soy sauce for flavor. Fragrant oil's fine in limited amounts, and soy sauce powder would be ideal, but I can smell a stupid impulse purchase a mile off, so let's just avoid that. Honestly, a great addition to this nut could be like horseradish powder to create a quote-unquote wasabi nut. Just be aware that some of the more fragile flavors like ginger or horseradish can lose a lot of their potency during the drying process if it gets a bit too hot. Alright, so same as the others, just spread these out a bit, but I'll be saving the other half of the sheet tray for the next ones, the paprika cumin almonds. This time I'll be leaving the skin on, since the strong spices really seem to benefit from the bitterness in the skin, which helps balance the flavor. It also gives a ton of little crooks and crannies, which increase the surface area, allowing us for even more spice coverage. You should know the deal by now. Toss, 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 tray up, move on, easy as. So the next one, the last one among the savory nuts, is my personal favorite. Cashew e pepe. Get it? Like cashew e pepe, but cashew?
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
No? Okay. So I use the aquafaba on these, which in hindsight is kind of stupid. I mean, why use the vegan alt on the only nut that has like non-vegan spices? You doofus. A kid called me that in 4th grade. I'm still shook to this day. For what it's worth, next time I do these, there'll be more Parmesan. I'll cook it darker and I'll chop it up properly. But regardless, these are great as they are. So all of these savory nuts we just did are dried at 300 Fahrenheit or 150 Celsius for about 10 minutes. So next up are candied poppy pistachio chunks. The nut to powder ratio is super different here, but if anything is easier for it. The sugar absorbs the liquid and almost becomes like a paste, making it near impossible to overmix in my experience. It's definitely a left field combination, but the two flavors actually complement each other very well. It's rare I find a dessert with poppy that actually has a pronounced poppy flavor, and these certainly do not disappoint. I'll admit though, that these are pretty visually polarizing. I love the way they look, the multicolored pistachios covered in little violet flecks and laterally with this little sugar frilly lace. It's actually really cool. However, if they aren't your thing, then I feel like you might love the next option. Maple honey candied pecans. Now, I used a blend of honey and maple syrup, and it's not just for the balanced flavor combo, but also just because honey's a bit too thick, and this brand of maple syrup is just a bit too thin for either of them to work alone particularly well. In this goes a ton of brown sugar, a bit of cinnamon, and just a hint of nutmeg just to help it all round out. Alright, so toss, whack it onto a sheet tray, spread it out evenly. You know the deal by now. These are going into a 320 Fahrenheit or 160 Celsius oven for about 15 or 20 minutes, along with a sheet tray of candied pistachios. It's fairly tough to judge the doneness just by sight in these, so if they come out pulling apart still like this, they need more time. Unlike the savory nuts, these won't easily detach themselves from the tray no matter what, but still, the best method for testing doneness is just taking out a nut, letting it cool fully, and trying it out. Once they've cooled fully on their own, they'll detach easily with just a bit of scraping action. They're still a little bit sticky on the outside. I mean, they're maple honey after all, but with just this amazing depth of flavor. I mean, they just taste like what a happy Thanksgiving dinner feels like. Our pistachios are back, they're looking great, they're acting much better, and they're just not sticky like before. I mean, they're just ready to rock some socks. Who says that? So there we are, the easy recipes. You can take it in literally a trillion different directions, riffing from just the same base recipe, whatever nuts and spices you want, just make it your own. If you find an amazing combination, let me know in the comments. Just be careful though. If you use a seasoning blend, most of them contain wildly varying percentages of salt, so you're gonna have to factor that into your recipe. Next up, candied and caramelized hazelnuts done in a pan. Definitely a bit more challenging, mainly because the timing can be really tight at the end. Both start out the same, sugar with just a little water in a large pan. On the side, make sure your hazelnuts, salt, butter are weighed out, and also prep your sheet tray with its sill pad. Get the syrup boiling and mix in your hazelnuts. Early on, while there's still some water, you can play it fairly cool, but that water evaporates off fairly quickly. You'll notice a bunch of interesting stage transitions as it cooks, from liquid to sappy to sandy, and then finally like smoky and caramelized. You can take them off at the sandy stage if you just want some basic candied hazelnuts, or you can just be a bit of a daredevil and just keep on pushing until the pan's like properly smoky and the hazelnuts are beautifully coated. Pour them onto your sheet tray and then mix in your butter and salt. The tiny bit of butter not only gives a shiny gloss to the nuts, but also gives a layer of fat to help prevent them from sticking to each other, because I mean, they're covered in caramel. Caramel likes to stick. Once they're fully cooked, just whack it to the side. You can see here how the hazelnuts I totally intentionally fired from the pan during the sandy stages are quite different, and maybe what you just personally prefer. Alright, let's move on to our expert level recipe, Nut Praliné. The most commonly accepted meaning of praline depends on your country and region of origin, as it's generally just a catch-all term for a nut-based confectionery. This derivative of praline comes courtesy of the French and is probably the most difficult nutting technique that doesn't actually blend into the realm of chocolatry, i.e. Belgian pralines. So this starts out simply enough, just water, corn syrup, and sugar in a pot. Now, corn syrup, golden syrup, professional glucose, whatever you can easily find also depends on your region, but all are just forms of inverted sugar which just help prevent premature crystallization. While that's caramelizing, let's take a look at our nut blend. Now, despite ostensibly being a pine nut praline, I opted for a 60-40 blend of pine nuts and blanched almonds for a bunch of reasons. First and foremost, I don't know if you guys know, but pine nuts are often expensive. However, even beyond that, pine nuts alone are a bit too soft to make a properly textured praline, and almonds are fairly tough and mildly flavored, just making it the perfect foil. No need to stir your caramel, just give it a swirl once you start seeing color starting to form. If anything, stirring with a spoon or something only serves to cause frustrating premature crystallization. I often see folks stopping their caramel when it's still too light as well, because it's easy to be tricked by the false color. My best advice is always just dip something in, and definitely not your finger, and see how a thin layer of caramel looks. Almost always, it can be cooked more for a deeper depth of flavor. When it's ready, just pour it over your nuts evenly, and definitely try not to make a big dangerous splash in the middle like this idiot, who now has to feverishly try to spread things around before it gets too hard. Leave it out uncovered until it's cool to the touch, then cover and leave for generally overnight to ensure that it is fully crystallized.
Bro, I forgot the salt.
Oh, and don't forget the salt.
Tomorrow.
The next day, crack it all up into a food processor. This is literally a bit of a make or break moment. Top-end professional models make quick work of this praline, but you probably don't have a $10,000 vacuum blender just sitting around, or even a $1,000 Robocoup, so I managed to make do with just this home model cuisine art, but not without a bit of a struggle. See, praline shouldn't be blended hotter than 104 Fahrenheit or 40 Celsius, otherwise you risk irreparably separating the fats and solids in the praline. This is rarely an issue for professional mixers, as the job is usually well done enough before the kinetic work of the blades actually heat up the praline too much, but the same cannot be said for home models. I watched the temperature fairly closely on this one and made sure to stop before I got into the danger zone.
Was there really a pine nut there the whole time?
I still had these fairly decently sized chunks of primarily caramel, so I knew the lazy way out of just straining it now will result in an unbalanced final product. If this happens to you, just do what I did. Literally nothing for an hour. That's it. I put the lid on, played some old school RuneScape, and just came back to something I could work with again later.
One eternity later.
Alright, we're back. We dropped 8 degrees, and we're ready to send it again. Still the same idea, watch the temp closely, don't let it overheat, don't let it pass go, don't collect $200, all of it. However, this time I just called it. There was a noticeable amount of small irregular chunks left, but back at max temp again and with my patience just running out, I decided to just pass it all through a mesh strainer and just move on with my life. And voila. It's a super left field delicious caramelly nut paste. I mean, it can be used as a sub for like nut butters or paste in recipes just easily, or drizzle it on ice cream, spread it on toast. You can mix it with chocolate and feuilletine for like a crispy entremet base, or honestly just use it as a layer of its own. I mean, the opportunities are endless. All right, let's get these plated up because the algorithm gods say it must be so. Whether you do these just as a fun home project or as like a unique fundraising basis, there's literally infinite ways to customize these template recipes as you want. Enjoy it, and really don't forget, I'm a professional.